Listen to the hot dog.
Hello and welcome to This Date in History, aka TDH, your daily source of interesting and important events I consider enough to be worth sharing. Of course, there are far more events that have happened, and I encourage you to seek those out as well, for everything and everyone matters. It is all connected. Today is Moon's Day, aka Monday, June 21st, 2021. The music you are hearing in the background is Memory by Electronomia and Rudd. A link to that, as well as any other sources of videos and articles, are in the video description. Anyway, on with the show! In 1734, having been convicted of setting the fire that destroyed much of Montreal in New France, Marie Joseph Angelique was put to death. Being a slave, her name was given to her by her last owners, and whereas there is skepticism of her guilt, many believe, including myself, that she was the culprit. This is due to the fact that her owner's home was the first structure to catch fire, with much of what is known now as Old Montreal to soon follow. Jumping up roughly around 150 years, in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States captured Guam from Spain. This happened due to a strange series of events, starting with the Spanish military garrison's lack of awareness that the two nations were even at war, then the misinterpretation of warning shots as a salute. This led to the capture of the facility and subsequently Guam as a whole. 2 years later, in 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, Empress of China Dowager Cixi formally declared war on the United States, Britain, Germany, France, and Spain. This order followed her command of the execution of every foreigner in China days later, and pitted an 8-nation coalition against China and the Boxers. This conflict would not end until September 7th, 1901. In the year 1919, during the Winnipeg General Strike, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force fired a volley into a crowd of unemployed veterans, killing 2. Becoming one of the most famous and influential public outbursts in Canada's history, over 30,000 strikers brought the economy to a standstill in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Although this mistreatment of veterans reminds me of what my country still does today, but worse, the strike heralded a stronger labor movement and the tradition of social democratic politics in Canada. In 1930, France started enforcing one-year conscription, becoming the first modern nation to introduce universal military conscription as a condition of citizenship.
Future.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part too.
It would continue this practice, originating from post-revolutionary France, until it underwent a phasing-out process that lasted from 1996 till 2001. This enforcement couldn't have come at a better time because just 10 years later, in 1940, Italy attempted to invade France. Known as the Battle of the Alps, this ultimately unsuccessful military activity became the first major engagement for Italy during World War II and was the last of which with France. 2 years later, in 1942, also during World War II, Italian and German forces took Tobruk, resulting in the imprisonment of 33,000 Allied troops. This was the second battle for the city, the entire chapter starting 3 days prior. Having started a siege as far back as 8 months, the Axis took around 4,300 casualties, whereas the combined forces of the United Kingdom and South Africa suffered 2,000 dead or wounded. Also in 1942, surfacing near the Columbia River in Oregon, a Japanese submarine fired 17 shells at Fort Stevens. This became one of only a handful of attacks by Japan against the United States mainland during World War II. Although only suffering minor damage, this facility of a meager force of 2 artillery pieces and 1 aircraft could only laugh at I-25, the submarine commanded by Meiji Tagami. In 1945, the organized resistance of Imperial Japanese Army forces collapsed in the Mabuni area of the southern tip of the main island of Okinawa, bringing the battle to an end. Becoming one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Pacific Theater, and although supported by US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canadian naval forces, the US troop boots on the ground suffered between 14,000 to over 20,000 dead, along with a lot of vehicles and vessels, whereas Japan lost over 77,000 soldiers, with an additional 30,000 native Okinawan conscripts killed. Moving on up to the next century, in 2004 becoming the first privately funded spaceplane to achieve spaceflight, Spaceship One was born. Designed by Burt Rutan and built by Scaled Composites, its primary user was Mojave Aerospace Ventures. Eventually to retire later on October 4th of that same year, 2004, it now resides in the National Air and Space Museum. In 2005, having skirted justice for over 41 years, Edgar Ray Killen was finally convicted of manslaughter. The case having been reopened back in 2004, justice was finally served for James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner, the people Edgar Killen murdered. And in 2006, Pluto's moons, after having been recently discovered, were named Nix and Hydra. Having been found about a year prior back in 2005, they weren't the small planets. Yes, planets. Pluto is a planet, and if you say otherwise, I'll launch you into the sun.
What if I refuse?
Then you'll be fired.
Fine.
Out of a cannon into the sun.
Anyway, it wasn't until 2011 when a third moon, Strix, was found and named, followed by Kerberos in 2012. Births: Jim Brewer, 1967, Chris Pratt, 1979, Edward Snowden, 1983, Rebecca Black, 1997. Deaths: Gideon Sundbeck, 1954, Hector Boiardi, 1985, Madman Muntz, 1987. And that concludes the show! Once again, I encourage you to invest more time in history. You never know what may have happened in the past unless you find it yourself. Until tomorrow, be safe and keep an open mind!